listening to Road to CEO, nothing but in-depth interviews with executives about their journeys as CEO. I'm your host, Will Marlow, and I hope you enjoy the show.
Continue your education. So whether that is on your own of trying to find good books to read, podcasts like this, other folks to follow, whether it might be that you go back for some sort of formal education, in a further degree, or even a certificate or something. Again, keeps you on track, something that you get at the end so you finish it, right? But I think that that's really important, and you have to make the time to do that if you really want to have a career at the CEO level.
I'm here today with Kane, the CEO of Audubon International, an organization that was originally co-founded by Theodore Roosevelt over 100 years ago. It was reinstated in 1987 as a nonprofit with the mission of spreading environmental education and sustainable resource management around the world. Audubon International has helped organizations save millions of gallons of water, reduce reliance on pesticides, and reduce the amount of waste that ends up in landfills. I hope I'm getting that right. We'll find out soon from Christine. Christine, thank you so much for joining us on Road to CEO.
Well, thank you for having me.
Did I get that right about the focus of Audubon?
Yes, and we started originally as part of an organization people may be more familiar with about the Audubon Society. So we started as the Audubon Society of New York State, which is when Theodore Roosevelt and some other wonderful people got together to create the organization. And then it sort of went dormant. And as you said, we reinvigorated it in 1987. And as our mission and interests grew, it seemed appropriate to change the name to Audubon International.
I see. So what was the original focus of the group when it was founded over 100 years ago?
What you might consider to be a more traditional conservation group at that time, I guess. It was very habitat for birds focused. That's what kind of grew out of the whole Audubon bird portraits and stories. And so then, conservation and wildland protection. Mm-hmm. And then in the late 1980s, when our organization reinvigorated it, as I said, it started out a bit the same. We had some projects that focused on loon populations, which is a particular bird very native to the Adirondacks of New York, for instance, some backyard birding, kind of backyard habitat projects. And then, as word grew and our organization grew, we got requests to do other things. We looked at connections and ways to do other things, expand the mission and the impact. And then over the years, how we all view nature and climate has changed a great deal, particularly in the last years when we've been going through the pandemic, and so that all influenced our work.
I see. So it seems that you do services now with other organizations, with private companies, perhaps. Am I correct in saying that you now, help companies that need to create sustainable practices for their own businesses? Yes.
And it's an interesting symbiosis, I guess you could say, since we are a nonprofit organization, but we have found a way to work primarily with businesses who are and the people at those businesses who are looking for ways to improve through environmental practices and sustainability knowledge, how they are managing the overall business of their company. But what we like to help them with is their property management as well. So we work with some businesses that don't have that much property, for instance, and then their focus is more on interior and energy, for instance, some climate issues, things like that. And then we do work more primarily with businesses who do have actual property that's under their management, so they can implement sustainable practices themselves.
I see. So an organization that might not have a lot of property but has an office building would want to make sure that it's energy efficient, and you might help with that. And then an organization like a golf course that has a ton of acreage might need help with managing the practices around that property
Yes.
they own. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a good summary. Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah,
Okay.
I was going to say, we work primarily with businesses in recreation and hospitality. We define that very broadly. So that's everything from, as you mentioned, golf courses, resort properties, corporate office parks. We also work with cemeteries and public parks and other recreation spaces. So it's very broad constituency.
So how long has Audubon International been doing that type of work with private companies?
Well, from the beginning, but really one of the things that we thought would be helpful, and from an internal, from the company's internal perception as well as from an external perception, was to come up with ways that you can actually proceed along a plan, develop an environmental plan and then proceed along that and actually seek certification as a third-party validation for what you have accomplished and what you are continuing to do to contribute to, your individual property, but your surrounding neighborhoods and communities, and then and how all of that, what we're all doing, contributes to the overall global needs.
So when most people think of nonprofits, I think that they would probably assume that they're dependent on donations from private individuals. It sounds like you would have either a mix of that combined with revenue from the organizations you work with, or maybe you would just rely on the revenue from organizations you work with. Can you speak about that? What is do you rely on donations to any extent at this point, or is it primarily the revenue you get from your work?
We do get donations. Most nonprofits have kind of a three-legged stool, we call it, which is private donations or individual donations, grants, and then some sort of maybe contracts or fee-for-service type of approach. Mm-hmm. So we do have some individual donors. It's not our biggest focus. We do operate mostly on dues, which are also charitable donations. It's just a different approach to it. If someone joins an organization and you pay dues, you may not be thinking that you're making a charitable donation, but you really are. And so that's mostly how that works. And then, of course, as many nonprofits also, for instance, get sponsorships for events or for particular programs, or you might need to raise money for like a soup kitchen might need a van, to get supplies, things like that. So we do get grants, we have donations, and we have sponsorships, just like every other nonprofit.
So how long have you been with Audubon International?
I'm in my 6th year.
Okay. So you went through then, you were there for a good amount of time before the pandemic hit. And now you've led the organization through the pandemic, of course. What was that like? How did the pandemic affect you?
Well, I'm sure like many people in their personal lives, as well as many businesses, it affected us all on many levels, right? Many different levels. So some, for our office and our staff, of course, we had to close our office and people were still partially working remotely. We do own a building where our headquarters are, and we also don't use it all. So we rent out some space in that. And so we had a, landlord approach that we had to think about on taking care of our tenants. So we, upgraded our HVAC systems for, the ventilation issues. And we, of course, followed all of the requirements and above for, providing PPE and, sanitizers, closing off public areas, all that sort of, it's probably all I guess, fairly normal to us now. For our larger community, because we work in so many different sectors and we have, 6 different certifications that we work with, some areas were much more impacted. So, the hospitality industry really took a hit, but in some other areas in recreation, for instance, we do have a lot of golf courses, and golf became sort of a safe haven, if you would say, during the pandemic, because it was outdoor recreation. It was fairly easily accomplished to do the social distancing. It still gave you exercise. It brought you back to nature, or out into nature, I guess I should say. So it was a little up and down and uneven for us, and we were trying, and we still do, try to meet the needs of all the different members that we're working with.
Mm. So one thing that strikes me is that the pandemic caused so many people to work from home. I would assume that many of them are going to stay working from home, either in a hybrid capacity. Maybe they've gone from 5 days a week in the office down to 2 days a week in the office. I would think so. And I'm just thinking about this now, but so that what that says to me is that right now there are a lot of empty buildings out there, office buildings still, and many of them are not environmentally friendly, I would assume. And so I would think that could create an opportunity for Audubon, because now there are not just inefficient buildings, there are inefficient buildings that are not even being occupied or used in a really effective manner. Do you see people now? Of course, I'm sure that the owners of those buildings maybe don't want to invest in them necessarily, but at this moment, or all of them would want that. But do you see an increase in demand for people wanting to improve the efficiency of these buildings now that, since the pandemic? Has that increased?
Well, we're actually seeing an increase all across our membership and those areas that we work in. In particular, for your question, for commercial businesses or commercial buildings, also, I think there's always opportunity to increase, to better our operations and better our environmental footprint. I think we're seeing now a lot of information about how people are starting to go back to the office in many different forms, but where, for instance, we're in upstate New York, so we see what's going on in the New York City market, for instance, where rents were down. There was a lot of open space, and now rents are climbing again, and there's not as much open office space. So I don't know whether that window might be closing a bit. And it was really, as you're saying, it was a real catch-22. I mean, there are certainly a number of businesses like ourselves that took advantage of the slower use of the building to upgrade their facilities and their ventilation systems, et cetera. And so it's a little hard to tell how that's going to shake out.
Is the prime motivation for somebody that wants to improve their office building, is the prime motivation saving money on energy costs, or is it something else, like they want to just have a better environmental footprint?
Well, people come at that from all different ways, and it may be that someone may say, I want to do the right thing. I want to do something better for the environment. I want to do something better for my tenants, which is wonderful, and has the ability to do that. Other folks may really want to do that, but they have to make sure that they have the financial wherewithal to do it. So it's really a kind of a, two-pronged approach, I guess.
Yeah.
But, it does, that's one of the things we talk about, is how it does better, not only are there impacts and improvements on your, quality of life, but it can also at the same time provide positive impacts for the financial side of the business.
Yeah. So I'd love to hear about your progression as an executive. Did you always want to be a CEO?
Yes, I did. Yeah. Early on. And it's, I wasn't sure I was going to be working in the nonprofit world, I have to say, but I have really spent my whole career with maybe a short, maybe 5-year break where I was not in the nonprofit world. But I am very motivated by the social impact of the nonprofit world, and the fact that, as we just talked about, quality of life improvements and financial benefits don't have to be mutually exclusive. They don't have to be, one is not better or worse than the other. If they are symbiotic and working together, then I don't see any problem with that. And that's one of the reasons I decided to build my career in the nonprofit sector, is because I think there's more opportunity for that. There's often more opportunity for creativity in how you approach the mission of the organization. And often, not 100%, but often nonprofit work does provide a better quality of life for employees, because you have that mission-based focus, and it's a real attractor for people that work in this sector.
Do you see that? We hear about millennials really maybe being supposedly the first generation that really wanted that social impact in their work. Do you see younger people really being attracted to this type of work more in general?
Probably overall. But we get, the nonprofit, I have had many colleagues over the years who have come into the nonprofit sector at, a later point in their career, also because that's when they've realized that the quality of life or the positive social impact is as much of a driver for them as, perhaps your financial needs of working. And so they have the ability to find a way to put those two things together. But, millennials and, each generation as it comes along kind of shapes the work environment to their will, I guess you would say. But, millennials are perhaps more aware of social impacts than some of their predecessors, because that generation has just really dealt with a lot of very, very fast change on lots of levels, life, technology, health, climate. So I think they are perhaps more aware of the ability to tie all of those things together, and, have good impacts personally as well as professionally.
So you always knew that you wanted to be a CEO. How did you end up at Audubon International?
Well, my first love has always been the environment, and I started off working in general environmental issues, and then ended up in the land conservation field for some time. And and particularly in the nonprofit world, you have to raise the money, as we talked about earlier, to do the projects and carry out the mission. And so I said, well, let me make sure I round out my skills with, the fundraising aspect of things. Mm-hmm. And so I mapped out a career plan for myself, basically, of how I wanted to get certain types of skills, or either build them or obtain them. And then the types of nonprofit organizations, well, I shouldn't really say the type. I wanted to make sure that I worked at a variety of organizations, large and small, different types of missions, urban and rural, and sort of put those all together. And so doing that, I gained, that skill set that you need to be an executive director or a CEO in the nonprofit world, as well as in the business world. And so, then I reached a certain point, and I said, well, now what I really want to do, as we were just talking about a minute ago with the millennials, I really want to work in the environment. I want to work on environmental issues. That's where I started. That's where I'd like to close the circle. So I looked for a job and something that could be, sort of the capstone for my career, and found this position with Audubon International.
I think that's great. So you really had a plan from the beginning on how to make yourself a well-rounded executive, and you sought out diverse experiences to make yourself an attractive leader.
Correct. And so, oftentimes that involved, lateral moves as opposed to what you might think of an upward move. And I think it was important to do that because I was looking for, I was doing it for particular reasons. I wasn't necessarily, thank goodness, I have to say, I never have worked at a place where I was like, oh my gosh, I have to get another job right away. And so I had the opportunity to make the choice. Looking back, I probably could have shortened that plan a bit, I guess, but all's well. I'm happy with how it worked out and where I am now. So I think it made sense.
So I'd like to dig into that a little more. So you took a little longer than you think you needed to prepare. Is that what you mean?
Yes. Yeah, probably. In hindsight, hindsight is 20/20.
Now, why do you think that was? Was there any reason that you think you took a little longer than you needed to? Any particular reason?
Well, there was probably a couple of things in, along the way. There's we all go through stages of our life, so you have to adjust your plan to make sense for what's going on in your personal life, also. But then, I do think there's a number of studies, that show that women tend to be less aggressive, if that's the word, about applying for higher level positions if we don't think that we meet 100% of the qualifications as listed. So looking back, I think I probably could have been a little more aggressive in some of the jobs I passed on. I probably could have got them. But I was, falling into that mindset, I guess, of, I have to be 100% qualified in order to apply.
So
which,
is
of course,
that
not really the case?
So is that something that I would assume you probably mentor and talk to young women who are on their, career path early on. And is that something you speak to them about?
I do. And, I try to mentor the younger women on my staff at all the places where I have been, but I also participate in some more organized, if you would call them that, mentor programs. So yes, I do mention those things. There's also another topic, which you probably touched on with some of your other speakers, called impostor syndrome. And, I think it's important to just not that you have to, you should be aware of it, I guess, as early in your career as possible. It doesn't strike only women. There are certainly other people who find themselves in that same situation. But, again, there are plenty of studies that show it's very significant for women, as particularly as you get to the higher levels in your career within businesses or in the nonprofit world. So I think the earlier you're aware of that, the earlier you can either change the way you operate, change the way you think, or create strategies for yourself that enable you to work around it, or in some cases, you have to work with it sometimes, because there are other people. There's always outside influences and other people on your career, and if other folks may not be the imposter syndrome from their approach, but we all have our own behaviors and biases that we have grown up with or that we have learned in the workforce. And so, you have to be aware of those. And I think that's where it can be very important to be very strategic, so that if you recognize something, you can either, plan to work with it or around it, or perhaps make a move. But you have to be aware of it before you can do that.
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, and I think a lot of therapy is about helping people understand some of those types of issues where, you just being aware of a certain tendency you have or a certain phenomena that may impact your thinking or bias your thinking. You might not be able to change those things, but if you're aware of them, then you can kind of make decisions that maybe aren't controlled by those.
Exactly. I mean, I think that's kind of there's a saying, I guess, you can't change others' behavior, for instance, but you can change how you react to that behavior. So that can apply in your personal life as well as your work life. And sometimes I think maybe we forget that part. We forget that we can incorporate that into our work life.
So it sounds like you were very prepared for this role, but at the same time, it's probably impossible to be prepared completely. What's something that surprised you when you became CEO? Something that maybe you wish you'd known before taking over?
Oh boy. Well, let's see. Well, for me, I came to the organization at a time when we had some quick succession in the leadership role. Mm-hmm. And, there's always a number of different reasons why that happens. But until you step into that situation, I don't think you really understand the impact that can have on outside impressions of your organization. So I think I had to spend a little bit more time early on. I sound like I've been here so long, but 5 years goes fast. Just trying to rebuild relationships or reinforce relationships that we are not going anywhere. We're here. All organizations go through changes. So I think we've been successful at that.
So when you say quick succession, I think you mean that basically the previous CEO left after a short tenure. Is that what you mean?
Yes. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a challenge. I know, one of the CEOs that I follow a lot, Martin Sorrell, he talks about how I can't remember the average tenure of a CEO is. I can't remember how many years it is, but let's say 4 years at a publicly traded company. He says that that's one of the core problems for many businesses is that, you have this short tenure. And then if you look at other executive positions, like a chief marketing officer, the average tenure for a chief marketing officer might be about 19 months. And, that's really, your job in the executive suite is to be thinking long-term. And if you're there 19 months or 4 years even, is that enough time to be thinking long term? And I think in a lot of ways the answer is maybe no, because an organization, Audubon has, technically it has a 100-year history. I know it restarted in 1987, but I think I'm sure you want it to be here for another 100 years, and so a short tenure could be a big problem.
Yes, and and I may just clarify for English why, not because there was any issues. I mean, he moved, so that's the way it goes. But you then you stepped into that position, and and maybe it sounds to me like one of your first tasks was to make sure that that supporters and stakeholders understood that you're in it for the long haul. You've got a strategic mindset for it. Yes. And, so there's meeting people and telling them that. And then there's, still being here in my 6th year and, and working with them and proving that. So, each person who comes into a CEO role has a vision for where they think their company or organization can go or should go. And, if you're only here for, say, 19 months, you've begun to implement things, and that can be good and that can be difficult, right? So sometimes it's very difficult to be a disruptor as an organization, even if it's really needed. And so, if someone felt that was needed and you begin disrupting things, and it takes a long time when you're implementing changes to get everything running smoothly, and have everybody on board again. And then if you leave, say, halfway through that or something, and then another person comes in with another vision, and then they, disrupt again, whether they intend to or not, because they might stop that previous plan and start a new plan. And then, you've got your employees don't know which way you should be going. And that, people on the outside of your organization, they see that and they realize that too. So it is important to have, first of all, for the organization to have in the nonprofit world, particularly to have a strong mission and adhere to that mission. And then the way that the leadership of the organization implements that mission is also very important.
Yeah. So
that's where that long-term part comes in that you're mentioning.
Yeah. How would you describe the job of a CEO? And, using yourself as an example, because we're kind of talking around a lot of strategic issues and things like that. How would you summarize, what is your job as you step in as CEO?
My first reaction was to go, when you step in as CEO, hopefully you have had the time to do some homework before you got to the organization, so that you're coming in with some thoughts. I don't adhere to the belief that you should, sort of start full force on day one. I think it's important to understand, again, in the nonprofit world, a lot of this is the same, whether you're in the corporate world or the nonprofit world. But, nonprofit mission, as you may have noticed, I keep mentioning that, is very important to me. And I think it's key to the sector. Mm-hmm. So I think you have to be a little bit more careful with your disruption, right? Or major changes. And so if you come in on day one, I had some colleagues a number of years ago that worked in an organization, and they had a new person come in who came from the corporate world and fired everybody on day one. And, it's like, so, I'm not in that world at all, but I think you have to do your homework before you get there. You need to have kind of a vision of where you think it makes sense to go and how you could help the organization to go there. And sometimes it's just to be better at what it is that the organization is doing. And other times it's, maybe taking a bit of a change. We've done both of those things at Audubon International. And it's just important, I think, to have a good sense of yourself, so that you can convey that to your new colleagues and get that sort of wonder and perhaps nervous. There's always sort of nervousness when a new person comes in, as then you're saying, like, what does this mean for me? Yeah. So I think it's important to recognize that and try to help people understand, your approach, and that, in my particular case, it's not going to be slash and burn or, major things on day one or even week one, so that you can build relationships now with your new colleagues, get the information that they have that you need to learn, so that they feel comfortable enough to give you that information, right? And to work with you for the betterment of the organization.
So how have you changed as since taking on the role of CEO? What have you learned?
That's a good question. I think I definitely have grown as a person. I think I have bettered my leadership skills since I've come into this position. This is a fairly large organization in terms of the scope of our work. Mm-hmm. We're in all 50 states in the United States, all 10 provinces of Canada, and 34 other countries around the world. So that's a very kind of sprawling approach to things. Yeah. We're in a growth spurt, I guess I would say, or a growth plan, I should say, because in our strategic plan, that was part of the goal, was we really need to expand our staff, go deeper on our certifications and other services that we're offering. So, when you're leading an organization like that, it's a different, I think it certainly was a different for me than any place I had worked before. So I think I've strengthened and developed my leadership skills. You have to have good communication skills, particularly, during the pandemic. I think we all demonstrated how we had to all pivot and learn. Some people have to learn how to work from home. Other people have to learn to manage people who are working from home. And then you still have, for us, like we still had a building, we still had tenants, we still had programs and services we had to deliver. So, you have to be flexible, and you have to be very flexible.
How big is the organization at this point in terms of team? How big is the team?
Yeah, well, we have 8 people right now. We actually have a couple of openings. So 10 is where we want to be right now. We probably will get a little bigger. We might get to 12 after that. It's a very lean and efficient team. A lot of members on our team travel quite a bit because as part of our certifications, we do in-person site visits. Now, during the pandemic, we had to do some more of those remote, which again is pivoting as to how you're going to do that, and have people with Zoom and their cameras and, showing you what you want to see and need to see. But, we have a lot of moving parts anyway. So we have folks every day that are out traveling and visiting our members and doing either initial certification site visits. Once you're certified, you have to recertify with us every 3 years. There's a couple different processes for how that works. So, even pre-pandemic, we had a lot of moving parts. So making them, all work well during the pandemic was very challenging.
Yeah. So you talked about you want to hire another 2 team members. What types of traits are you looking for now when you are hiring team members? Are there certain things that you want in order to make sure that you're hiring somebody who's a good fit for the organization?
Yeah, well, for us, and probably for more businesses now, as we're coming out of this pandemic, but always for us, there certainly is a certain level of education that you're looking for, knowledge in the sustainability field, different property management practices and approaches. But also, we are looking for people who have the ability to take ownership of a project and go with it, and are, have confidence in themselves and their abilities to do that, because we have such a travel schedule. So, you're out in the field and you have to be able to make decisions about what's, going to happen, how you're going to, maybe somebody you get there and I don't know, they're out sick, so you can't do that visit that day. So, what's going to happen on that? How are we providing the services to the folks in the particular sector within your within your responsibility? So we really look for, as I said, a basic educational understanding, but we're really looking for people who can manage themselves, who have good people skills, good communication skills, and also, good organizational skills. So whatever that means. I mean, people use a lot of different techniques to keep themselves organized.
Yeah.
But, to have an awareness of that and an ability to do it is important.
So,
and we want people, I like to build sort of what I call a collegial atmosphere in cultures and organizations, in that, everybody works together, but, you have to be willing to take input from other folks, whether, you think it's somebody that, maybe you think it's, we're not that vertical. We don't have that many people, but, I have worked with folks before people who they consider below them on the corporate rungs. They don't really want to take input from them.
Mm.
And that, I don't think that's a good idea. So I try to encourage, you have to be willing to take input and also, give input, and we want it to be constructive and helpful. But I don't want anybody to feel like they can't, talk to somebody else in the organization and have a meaningful role.
So I want to make sure I understood one thing you said on this, though. So you said that you really value hiring people who are confident in acting independently and they're kind of capable of, it sounds like, implementing things on their own. Did that become more important after the pandemic?
Well, yes. I mean, it's Yes, I mean, it's going to be more important going forward, but it was something that, since I've been here anyway, that we have always looked for. And folks who I have networked with who worked at the organization previously, I think definitely fell into that category. So I think it's probably always been in the culture of the organization. Now, for overall, for businesses, I think it's going to be more important going forward.
So essentially, so that's always been a positive trait, of course. And it's, I mean, it, doesn't take a genius to know why that would be a positive trait to have. But it's interesting that because I think with the pandemic and, people are not in the same office all the time or as often as they were before, I think those traits are now critical, or, maybe they went from being very positive traits to being essential traits. Is that accurate, do you think?
I think so. Yes, I do. I think it's going to be.
Yeah, I think, I haven't heard that articulated before, but I think that, I agree with you that will be important for other businesses and for, other nonprofits. And, I know, so for me, I have a 25 person company where that has always been virtual. And so going back about 10 years now, it's been virtual. It wasn't always 25 people, but, when the pandemic hit, it didn't require the type of adjustment that other organizations probably needed, because we've always had to manage things virtually.
Right.
And one of the things we realized a long time ago was you need people, first of all, you need managers, but you also need team members who don't really need to be managed. If you require too much management virtually, it creates too many challenges.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I totally agree with you.
Yeah. Interesting.
Well, and I think that, that may become a more common skill, if I want to say that, going forward, just because, again, millennials and particularly, but also some of the generations immediately preceding them, much more technology, native technology folks, much more willing and able to work remotely. So I think just the understanding of how workplaces and jobs may change or are already changing, we may find is a little bit more native as we go ahead and in the next 10 years with our hiring and long-term changes to our organizations brought about by the pandemic.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about processes. What about metrics? Do you use any key metrics for measuring success at Audubon?
Actually, that's one of the things that I've been working on since I came to the organization. And sometimes you'll find in the nonprofit world that can be a problem area. Because when you're providing services and perhaps intangible services as opposed to products, it's a little bit harder to find ways to measure your performance. So if you're, I worked at a social service agency years ago. Over here you've got the food co-op and the soup kitchen, so you can easily say, well, how many people did we feed today? How many bags of groceries did we give out? But then you have folks who are coming in for therapy, family therapy, stuff. And that's much, much harder to measure you can certainly say, well, how many people are coming in for services, but you need to see how the services are going right on the other end. So it's much harder to do that. So for us, we certainly have set up now, and as part of our strategic plan, a different approach to the numbers of our organization. So the certification programs that we have, how many organizations are in them, percentage certified versus working towards certification. Unfortunately, sometimes places become decertified because they don't keep up with the program. We find a lot of times that is due to personnel changes, and maybe they just don't understand the program, so they put it on the back burner. And So there's a lot of reasons for that. So we're much better now with those numbers because they are, easier to track. But it's a little harder in terms of, how do you really track the impact of sustainable activities or, property management. So you have different, places may have different inputs. So they could be nativizing, the property, their corporate office park areas, golf courses that are not using, they don't use all of the property. They usually use 30 to 40% of the property for golf. And then the rest of it is either out of play or supplemental areas like the golf cart barn or the clubhouse or something like that. So, how you find out the impact on the people using that property, right, is much more difficult to find. So if it's a resort, like I would say in the last, 10 years, most of the time if you go to a hotel now, there's a little card in there that says something about like, we don't make us wash the towels every day, right? So we can save the water, and that's important. And, 10 years ago, we didn't see that at all. They came in every day, they took the towels. So, but, you can measure that perhaps through the less water that you're using. But again, if you're not paying for that water, if you're on a well, or in, certain, like in New York City, for instance, a lot of buildings are not older buildings. The individual units are not metered separately. So you can't really, I saved X amount because I did this less thing. You can't really tell that. So that's what it's hard. We're still wrestling with some of that. We try to ask for information from our members that they can supply us with things like that, less water used, less fertilizers used, less mowing schedule, right? So now you're really reducing your carbon footprint. Again, composting. We have folks that are doing biodigesters, upgrades to your ventilation system. I mean, it's all, unless you bring it back to something like electricity use, water use, it's much harder. We're still kind of wrestling with the best way to track that information.
Yeah, it's a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
So I always like to ask, was there ever a time in your career where you felt like, you always knew you wanted to be CEO? Was there ever a time when you wanted to give up on your plan and you just wanted to pack it in because something was too hard?
I don't think so. Nothing's coming to mind. There's always challenges, as I said, with, perhaps the organizations that along the way, where, either it was not a good fit for me. So, as I said, I wanted to work in different things. And so there was a couple times I was at organizations and, the mission just wasn't resonating enough with me. Not that it wasn't a great mission. And those were particularly times where I was heading up the fundraising operation. So you really have to be 100% behind that mission to go out and raise funds for it. So it didn't make me want to pack it in. It just made me realize that, again, learn more about myself and where I need to work and the type of mission work I need to do to really be proud of it and myself and effective.
Interesting. Well, I really appreciate your time today. Thought this was a great discussion, and I know that people are going to benefit from hearing about your path. Were there any topics that you wanted to cover that we didn't get to?
Well, I guess I would just say that one of the things that I found particularly helpful, and it's, sometimes it's really hard to find that, is to continue your education. So whether that is on your own of trying to find good books to read, podcasts like this, other folks to follow, like there's a couple of different people, the books that you can use, whether it might be that you go back for some sort of formal education, in a further degree or even a certificate or something. Again, keeps you on track, something that you get at the end so you finish it, right? But I think that that's really important, and you have to make the time to do that if you really want to have a career at the CEO level.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's great advice.
Thanks.
Well, thank you again for joining us. Been a great episode. And is there any way that are there any links or anything you want to share for how people can support Audubon or follow Audubon for updates? Any
Sure.
you want to share on that?
Yeah. Well, our website is audubon.international.org because we're a nonprofit, and so we get lots of people say, "Oh, Audubon, like the Audubon in Germany." So it's AUDUBON international.org. We're on social, so we have Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. And we have a number of, on our website, you'll see there's, a news area where we have blogs and information about what's going on. So those are the simplest ways to follow us. And then if you're, running a business and you're interested in, what you might be able to do, and we'd be happy to work with you. And we offer 6 different certifications, as I said, that are based in, our biggest program is what we call our Audubon Cooperative Sanctuary Program. And so that's for places that are operating now, they're not building new or anything, and they have some property that they can manage that's under their management. In the hospitality industry, for instance, we have some green lodging for resorts and places with lodging, but we have green hospitality for those that don't. And also under our ACSB program, as I mentioned, we have parks and cemeteries. And that was really interesting, I think, during the pandemic. Many cemeteries are in urban areas now, and they have nice, flat, wide, paved places, and oftentimes lovely specimen trees. And so they have become kind of recreational areas almost. And then we have our signature sanctuary, which is for sort of properties that are either built from new or under some sort of renovations. So as we like to say, we can incorporate the sustainability even below the ground and up. So happy to work with anybody that would like to find out more information about that. And it's all on our website.
We'll post links with the episode, and I hope that people will reach out and connect with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me today. I've really enjoyed talking with you.